All right, so here's our second video on evolution and the different ways in which evolution occurs in populations. Okay, so we have some factors that are going to influence evolution. Okay, we have natural selection, sexual selection, mutations, genetic drift, and gene flow. All right, so all of these 5 right here are going to affect evolution and how it occurs. So, we've been talking about genetics, and you know from genetics that an allele is one copy of a gene. Whether it's dominant or recessive, it's a copy of a gene. So allele frequency is going to be the number of times an allele shows up in a population. Okay, so if we have a trait for really heavy fur in rabbits, and these rabbits all of a sudden are in an Antarctica or an Arctic situation, we're going to have an allele frequency of that really thick fur to keep them warm and to keep them alive is going to start to increase the colder the environment that they're in. Okay, so all of these 5 factors right here are going to change this value here, so the allele frequency. So this is basically how evolution occurs, is that you are passing on these traits, but you're also increasing these traits in those populations. Okay, so our first one, which we've already talked about a little bit, so natural selection, so his theory of natural selection. So that some individuals are going to be more fit than others for their certain environment. So because of that, they're going to survive and reproduce at a higher rate than others that don't live as well or reproduce as well in that environment. So any of the alleles that are more advantageous are going to become more frequent. So their allele frequency is going to increase for those advantageous alleles. All right, so natural selection is going to be driven by different environmental pressures. So how much of a food supply you have, what kind of predators there are, if there's parasites or disease. Okay, so certain predators, if you're the faster animal and you have a predator that's chasing you, hopefully those traits of those ones that are surviving are going to be passed on. Okay, so our next one is sexual selection. So as long as mating is not random, all right, so if there's a reason that certain individuals are mating with certain other ones, sexual selection can influence evolution. Okay, so we're assuming that we're just not having everybody mating with everybody for no reason at all. What's happening is that certain individuals are going to be attracted to other individuals because of particular traits. Okay, so that means that this trait that they're attracted to is going to reproduce at a higher rate. So specific traits are going to be preferred. So whether that's a very colorful peacock or whether that's the really strong male bison or whatever it is, these alleles are going to become more frequent because they are preferred. So because certain animals are going to be reproduced with more often, their alleles are going to pass on. Okay, this doesn't mean that it's going to make them fit for the environment. That's important, okay? So just because these are sexually what is being favored by those animals does not mean it's going to help them live in the environment. So this is actually going to kind of could counteract our natural selection part of it. All right, so bright colors, for example, in peacocks or other animals may not be the best for hiding from predators, but they're going to attract mates very well, so that they are still going to be passed on through that population. Okay, so mutation. We've talked about this a ton. You all know what this is. So during meiosis, we have mistakes formed. DNA copying mistakes are formed. So these are our mutations. They can result in new alleles, okay? And as we talked about, mutations are not a bad thing, necessarily. Obviously, the ones that make your DNA not work, the ones that cause you to have a disease that's going to kill you, obviously are a bad thing. But, for example, I've already used, red hair is a mutation. That's not a bad thing, all right? It's just a different thing that happened. So, if we have a mistaken DNA and the DNA, let's say, ends up coding for slightly longer legs, you have a new variation in the population now. And if this is for, let's say, giraffes, that could be advantageous and passed down to offspring. All right, so this is how new things are introduced into a population, is through mutation. And then those traits, if they're advantageous, are going to be passed down and then amplified. So that allele frequency could all of a sudden increase when it didn't even exist before. Okay, so genetic drift. This is going to happen when populations are small. Okay, so when we have a small population, it's usually either due to a mass die-off of the population, or if an individual or group of individuals move from a certain environment to another that's isolated, this can also happen. Okay, so populations can change due to random chance, and some alleles are going to become more frequent simply by chance. Okay, so the two ways that this can happen. We have the first one, which is the bottleneck effect. So basically what happens is we have a mass die-off of individuals, so only a certain amount are left. Those number that are left could have advantageous alleles, could have disadvantageous alleles. But the thing is only their alleles are going to be left, and we're going to have allele frequency change just because of the majority of the population dying off. Okay, so this can all of a sudden increase a certain gene. All right, the founder effect is when a population, a certain individual from a population decide to move to a different area and are founders for a new population. And so their traits or their alleles are going to be the only ones passed on also. Okay, so that's what genetic drift is. All right, now we have gene flow. So this is basically a gene or a new type of allele is going to flow into an existing population, if you think of it that way. So we could have an individual that comes from a different area that has a different set of genes come in and start mating in that population that's already been established. So these alleles are going to enter the population with these new individuals, all right? So let's say we have green geckos living in the forest and a yellow gecko comes in, wanders in, and mates with a green gecko. This could produce more yellow geckos, and natural selection might begin to act upon this population. Okay, so gene flow just means a new gene has flown into the existing population. So that's also how we're getting some evolution occurring. Okay, so when we're talking about species are a group of organisms that are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so when we're talking about different species of animals, this means that they are a set group of individuals that cannot mate with another species. Okay, so if when you mate a horse and a donkey and you get a mule, that's not a new species because mules are infertile, all right? If we have different species of, let's say, Darwin's Galapagos finches, they were all separate species because they were not able to mate with the other ones, okay? There's some genetic factors that play into how this happens that we're not going to get into too far. But just know the species are able to interbreed and produce offspring within themselves, but not with other species. Okay, speciation is the creation of a new species. Okay, so that just means that's how we get new species formed. Okay, so this happens due to reproductive isolation. So that means two populations of the species cannot mate. That might be, for example, for these birds of the same species begin singing different songs. So they're not attracted to the other song, the mating song, so that they're not going to reproduce. So they're isolating themselves reproductively. Geographic isolation means a geographic physical barrier has separated a population into two populations. So let's say if you're in a lake and all of a sudden a dam or something pops up, and let's say it separates those two bodies of water into two, you could take one population and whatever side of the dam that those fish end up on, those can develop into two separate populations because they've been isolated geographically. Okay, so when we go to talk about species relationships, we're going to look at this a little bit more in depth, but we have things called cladograms. And so these are going to show the evolution of species and how different species are related to each other and what they have in common. All right, so if you look here, this is the main part of a cladogram, and then these branches come off at different times. Okay, so these blue lines are all going to connect to a different type of species of animal. These little red lines are going to be traits or characteristics that these animals have. So vertebrae is at the bottom here. That means everything past this red mark right here has a vertebrae. So sharks, the fish, all of these. Okay, if you notice, we have the sharks coming off, and then all of a sudden, bony skeleton comes in. So this means that the sharks have vertebrae, but they do not have a bony skeleton, because that trait did not develop until after these had come off. Okay, so bony skeleton, then we have the fish, and everything else, all these up here have a bony skeleton. Now, our next step is the four limbs. All right, so our fish didn't have four limbs, so they branched off here, and then the rest of these animals up here have four limbs. Okay, now these amphibians have four limbs. However, because they branched off before they hit this part, they do not have an amniotic egg. Okay, so they do not have that at all. So they have four limbs, a bony skeleton, and vertebrae, but they don't have the egg. Now, when you look here, we have a branch off, and actually two things come off here. Okay, so they have an amniotic egg, and then these two species developed hair. All right, so this is just for these two. If you notice, the rest of these three and the crocodiles and birds do not have hair. Okay, so that's why that's coming off right there. And our very last thing right here is eggs with shells. All right, so that just means that everything that branched off before this doesn't have an egg with a shell. However, the things that come off of this afterwards, both of these have eggs with shells. So in this case, these traits that we're looking at, in this instance, crocodiles and birds are the most closely related things on this tree. Okay, which seems a little counterintuitive from what you've learned before, or what you would automatically think. You would think maybe crocodiles and amphibians are more closely related, but if we're looking at these different traits and how they developed through evolution, these two are actually most closely related. And then obviously the primates, rodents, and rabbits are all very closely related because they have all these traits in common. Okay, so that's how we use cladograms, and we'll do an activity with this to kind of go over this more, but that's just an introduction. All right, so that's our second part of evolution.